Hello, and welcome to Senior Code Review Buddy. My name is Chris, and today I'm going to talk about writing tests for a file that doesn't have any yet. I've got a relatively simple and small file from a podcast project that I've been working on that I realized was untested. So I'll share this file with you and walk through how I went around writing tests for this file and what changes I ended up making to that file as a result of adding tests. All right, here is the initial file, copy underscore file. We've got a private function underscore copy file over impl. We've got a public function main, and we've got a little bit of code at the bottom to handle calling into main if this file's run as a script. So the first thing I'm going to mention is I think the only thing I should be testing here is main, because this is the main public interface for this. I could write tests for main and for underscore copy file over impl, but no one should be directly interacting with this function. Every call to it should be going through main, so I think that makes sense as the only interface to test. So now that we know what function to test, let's take a look at it and see if there's any external state that we need to worry about. External state makes it harder to write tests because we usually can't just modify them by passing in different values to the functions, so they're a little harder to sort of set up correctly. Looking at main right now, we have parser.parseArgs, which, since it's called without any arguments, will actually look at sys.argv to determine what values to parse. So this is kind of an external dependency here. So we could just modify sys.argv before each call in the test. That could work, but there's actually an easier way here. Python actually lets us pass the arguments into argparse. So we can just add a parameter to main, args. We will just pass that to that. So we have now taken the sort of external dependency and done some basic dependency injection for it. All the existing callers, like down here, are able to just now call it with sys argv. You'll note that I do have a 1 here to drop the first value of sys.argv. That's because that's the file, and that's actually not needed when you're passing this into parseArgs. All right, so now with this, all of our callers are going to work the way they did before, and it'll be easy to pass in the arguments we want for a test. One other small change I should make is we currently are using args here and args here. This is a clash. We should probably change this to parsed args. Oops. Okay, so with that, let's look at the flow of the code now and figure out what test cases we should have. So it looks like we've got two flags. We've got dry run and archive folder. Archive folder technically isn't a flag. It is a string that represents the archive folder to use. But the way we're treating whether it's been set or not, it kind of functions as a flag. There don't seem to be any other interesting conditions here or flows. So I think we just need these 4 test cases. Dry run archive, dry run no archive, prod run archive, prod run no archive. I do realize that the way I've sort of described this here, we're not going to pass anything different for file path. We're not going to do any different types of files. We're not going to be changing the prefixes. We're not going to be changing the name. We're not going to change the speed. And I think that's okay, because if you sort of look at what's happening here, for the most part, we're just kind of piping these values into prepare audio and move. So the different combinations of those should probably be tested there. So with that, let's go over and see what the test file starts to look like. We've got 4 test cases to start. Dry run archive, dry run no archive, prod run archive, prod run no archive. I've also set up some common variables that I think all the tests are going to need in setup. In fact, when creating this common data here, I made another change to the production code. Currently, we have the flag podcast and file path. And at first glance, it's not clear what the difference is between the two of these. They're both strings. Looking into it, podcast is actually the name of the podcast show. So I took this opportunity to change this flag name from podcast to podcast. show name, which I think is much clearer now and sort of differentiates the difference between the podcast show name and the file path to the podcast itself. So we've now got our 4 initial variables: podcast show name, podcast file, destination, and archive, and the holding folder, but none of the tests are going to be accessed directly. And I'll start now by filling in a single test. Let's start with dry run and archive. Made the args for this flow, pass it into the function. I tried running this, and it failed. And it failed because the flag names were wrong. I had the right words, but the flags had been declared with underscores between the name, not dashes. Generally speaking, I do think dashes are better, because when the whole name is using dashes, you're not starting with dashes, then using underscores. I think it's clearer. So I updated the flags to use dashes instead of underscores, and got this basic test passing. Although at this point, passing just means it's not crashing, which is a good start, and we've already addressed one issue with this. So now let's add 2 simple checks to ensure that, since this is a dry run, there isn't a file in the destination folder or the archive folder. All right, so I added 2 checks that I talked about, using in both cases new class variables, because all of my tests are going to want to check whether these files exist or not. I ran it, and it worked. So yay. With this now, I will go and fill in the other 3 tests. They're basically going to be the same pattern as this, with the only difference being maybe I'm changing the state here, depending on whether I expect the file to exist or not, and obviously I'll have to change the arguments as well. So let's go see what that looks like. All right, so I've now got all 4 tests created, and when I ran it, I ran into a few new errors. First, I was getting an exception for both of my prod runs, telling me that a file path didn't exist. It's telling me the destination file path didn't exist. When I poked around a bit, I realized that when we create this destination folder path, we don't actually create this folder. So copy file later on was assuming that the folder existed, and when it didn't, it was failing. So my 2 options here are I can create the folder in the test, or I can update copy file to create the folder. In thinking about it, I think it makes sense to do that here in the test by adding os.appears self-destination. And I say this because sort of how copying work, I think it's a safe assumption to assume that this destination folder exists, and if it doesn't exist, we probably do want an exception to be raised instead of silently creating the folder and copying files there, because something's probably wrong if that folder doesn't already exist. Now, the other error I got was a little bit stranger. After this change, I ran the tests, and the 2 dry runs passed, no problem. My first production one ran, then the second one failed, and it failed because the test file was missing. And when I ran again, both of them failed because the test file was missing. So the problem here is I've got a bad name. This file is called copy file, but it doesn't actually copy the file. If we look at the implementation here, the last function that's called when we're not a dry run, prepare audio and move. So the file isn't getting copied, it's getting moved. So our initial file shouldn't exist anymore. So this tells me 3 things. 1, we should change this file from copy file to move file to make this clear, and change this function from copy file over impl to move file over impl. That will avoid people in the future thinking that it's not going to touch your original file. Second, in our test setup, we need to make a copy of the test file for each test, because they're potentially going to move it. Third, as part of the checks in our test, we should check to see if the initial file is still there or not after we run. If it's a dry run, the file should be there. If it's not a dry run, the file should have been moved. So this is our final test code. As mentioned, we are now making a copy of the test file instead of working on the one checked into the repo, so that if it is moved, it's okay, it's not the main one. and we've got our 4 tests, and as I look at them, I do realize that this part of args is repeated for all of the tests, so we probably could move this into something like self.argsBase, only have to declare it in the setup and have each test use it. In fact, that'd probably be a good thing to do, because then show name and destination, they don't need to be self variables anymore, because they would only be getting used in the setup function, so they could become just local variables there. Makes things a little simpler. Even with that in mind, I'm quite happy with how this looks. It's nice to have tests here now. All right, and here is our final code. There are only 3 changes from the initial code. First of all, main now takes an args. Instead of having parse args, read it directly from sys.argv. I changed the flag names to have dashes instead of underscores. And of course, I changed the file from copy file to move file. Each of these changes is, I think, a nice improvement to the overall flow of things. But most importantly, there's tests for this now. Thanks for walking through that with me today. If you have any other comments, code you'd like me to review, or ideas you'd like me to talk about, please leave a comment below or reach me at chris@seniorcodereviewbuddy.com. Thanks, and have a great day.